Welcome, everybody, to this special bonus episode of Daily Dose of Aramaic. I'm thrilled to welcome a special guest, Dr. Eldon Clem. Rabbi Eldon Clem has served as a professor at Jerusalem University College since 2011 and is the director of the Department of Hebrew and Semitic Languages. He also teaches Hebrew and Semitic languages online at the Institute for Torah and Semitic Languages. He earned his MPhil and PhD from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, where his dissertation was the Peshitta text of Hosea as a translation. He received his rabbinical ordination in Israel from Rabbis Shlomo Riskin and Boaz Pash. Dr. Clem is the translator of Targum Onkelos for Accordance Bible software, and this translation is now available in book form as well. I picked this up at SBL, and those who have been watching recently have seen me comment on this book on Daily Dose of Aramaic. Throughout his lifetime, Dr. Clem has been a practitioner of several kinds of martial arts and is now an instructor of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in Israel. So welcome, Dr. Clem, to Daily Dose of Aramaic.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And I really appreciate your work and Adam Howell's work on Daily Dose of Hebrew as well. And the fantastic job you guys are doing of popularizing the study of the biblical languages. That's very important. And when I see the popularity that you guys have, wow, I mean, that's awesome. So it's an honor to be here.
Well, isn't it true that Adam Howell was once a student of yours?
Yes, he did. Unfortunately, I can't take all the credit for his work because he's had, he studied under a lot of other people besides me, but
Mm.
he did study, took a class with me, I should say, at JUC, and it's an honor to have had that. And of course, he's a sharp guy anyway before me, but.
Mm.
Uh,
Well, let me dive in with some questions for you in our limited amount of time that we have. I wish we could just go on, but this is for the benefit of people getting to know you and your work and how it really closely ties in with the study of Aramaic. So, Dr. Clem, could you please share what led you to become an academic in the field of Semitic studies?
Okay. Well, first I fell in love with the Hebrew language at 8 years old
Mm.
when I was adopted and given an Encyclopedia Britannica as a present. And what do you start reading in a book? You start at the beginning, and I started reading, and early on in the A volume, there was an alphabet article. And that started me off on, wow, the Hebrew alphabet and the Canaanite alphabet and all this other stuff. All the subsequent alphabets were based on that alphabet anyway. But the Roman and the Greek and the Arabic and Cyrillic and so on. I mean, there are other writing systems, but the alphabets came from that originally. And wow, I just fell in love with that. And I taught that to my friends so that we could write notes to each other in class. And if the teacher caught the note, she couldn't read it. And so I thought that was cool. And I even started this notebook where I'm gathering my alphabets and all the writing systems I could find from the ancient world, including Egyptian hieroglyphics and everything. I was collecting that in a notebook in my early childhood, just some stuff from the school library and the public library. I had no scholars around or anything that I could consult, and there was no internet in those days, but trying to collect everything I could. That was kind of and then of course, when I went to university and everything, then I formally studied this stuff. Uh,
Mm. Well, there are some of us who can indeed trace the roots of our interests in these fields as if this had always been what we were interested in. So it's great to hear that background story. Well, could you then please share about your present work at Jerusalem University College and the Institute for Torah and Semitic Languages?
Yes. So the Institute for Torah and Semitic Languages is for people that don't want to take study for credit. They just want to learn for learning's sake of the stuff that we teach, the Semitic languages and so on. But if somebody wants to get a degree, then of course I recommend Jerusalem University College. And one of the programs that we offer is Hebrew and Cognate languages, and there um, we run an alternating program with
Hmm.
alternating years. one year, like this year, was comparative Semitic sequence, where we did the first semester the inscriptional languages from the Iron Age, including Northwest Semitic dialects, including uh, Phoenician and Ammonite, Edomite, Hebrew inscriptions, Moabite, that sort of thing. And if there's time at the end, we might read some Old Aramaic. And then the second semesters, we do comparative Semitics. We do Akkadian and
Mm,
Arabic, classic Ethiopic, Ugaritic. And then in alternating years, we'd have an Aramaic sequence. First semester is always biblical Aramaic. And then, depending on how much time we have at the end of the semester, we'll read some of the papyri from Egypt in Imperial Aramaic. And then, second semester, I always give the students a choice of what they want to read. The students that took the first semester with me, I give them first dibs on what do they want to read second semester. Sometimes we'll read Jewish Aramaic dialects. Sometimes we'll read just Targumic Aramaic, and we'll read the Targumim together. Sometimes they want to read Rosenthal's Aramaic Handbook, and we'll
mhm.
just there. It's a summary of all the dialects. Now, bring in some additional stuff. It's not in Rosenthal, but or I've taught Syriac in some years. They wanted to do that, so in other words, depending on because I love Aramaic and there are a lot of dialects there. And, um, but anyway, and of course, Hebrew is always, we have Hebrew, it's ongoing, beginning Hebrew and then our, you know, our advanced Hebrew sequences and so on. But yeah,
Mm. Well,
excited
this
about
is
that.
the kind of audience it sounds like who would love to participate in that kind of study because having covered biblical Aramaic first on Daily Dose of Aramaic, now we're in Targumic Aramaic along with the different dialects that are involved with that.
Yeah.
So it's a burgeoning field for us here on Daily Dose of Aramaic.
Yeah. And it's exciting to see you guys going into that too and showing people the importance of that stuff.
hmm Well, actually, and I suspect you're going to speak some more about that here in the future, but let me just ask a question here. This is the kind of question that allows us at Daily Dose of Aramaic to get to know you, to get to know our guests, because we ask questions that I don't think would ever necessarily appear in writing in an article that we would write. It's about you. So here we go. Among the Aramaic scholars that we have hosted on Daily Dose of Aramaic before, you're the first martial artist. So this is good. Could you explain a bit about the role of martial arts in your life?
Yeah, as strange as it may sound, if there had not been the one, there wouldn't have been the other. To me, they're inextricably connected because if it hadn't been for the martial arts, I wouldn't have gone on to do scholarship and anything else I've done in my life.
Let's hear about that.
Yeah, to begin with, as a nerdy kid, I just wanted to be left alone with my books and study, and that was it. But going to school in inner city greater Chicago area. By that I mean Chicago itself and Hammond, Indiana, Gary, Indiana, all these places. You cannot study. I don't care if you're Albert Einstein. It's just a matter of survival. And I would eat my cereal dry in the morning, not drink anything all day from the morning till I came home from school in the afternoon. So I wouldn't have to go to the bathroom because there were roving gangs in the halls, in the bathroom,
Mm,
or whatever, all of that. And I was so traumatized by experiences there. So when I moved to Princeton, Indiana, the end of my middle school, beginning of my high school, um, of course, it was nothing like that. Thank God. It was a sleepy farming community. And I love those people. But when I went there, I was so traumatized from what I had come from that, I mean, I'm still ashamed of my antisocial behavior and everything, man. I really didn't know how to behave around people. And, uh, but it was the, the martial arts and boxing that gave me a sense of confidence that I could even just, you know, be confident in front of anybody. And, um, and, I don't think I really learned to socialize until I was in college. Uh, if then, some people might question, but at any rate, and that's why, at 64 years old, I've gone back to teaching martial arts again. teaching Gracie Jiu-Jitsu because you don't have to worry about getting brain damage with that. And
Hmm.
you can do that all of your life if you train smart. At 64 years old, I still get out on the mats and roll around with my students. But uh, and it's very important that I work with a lot of young people, and this is what gives our young people. It's the only way I could learn discipline. I could never stick with anything that I started
Hmm.
before that. And so and young men, especially young boys, have to be involved in some sport or they're
Hmm.
going to get in trouble. That's just all there is to it. You got to be in sports. And which is why I try to convey to the rabbis in the local area and whatever, you got to get behind a good sports program to deal with any juvenile delinquency problem. But at any rate, and so that's why I'm wanting to give back to the community by offering Gracie Jiu-Jitsu here. But at any rate, so I still do that, and in my mind, they're connected. Uh,
Hmm.
you
I
know,
wonder if we're going to have further guests who will say it's because of jujitsu, it's because of martial arts that there was the discipline then to become. I mean, we all know we pour our lives into our doctoral studies. It's no
yeah,
joke. The discipline to push through a
yeah.
program like that. So that's really fascinating to hear.
Uh,
Well, so here's a dedicated question about Aramaic. Why should a person dedicate their time and energy to studying specifically Aramaic?
yeah. Well, wow. To begin with, 10 chapters of the Bible are written in Aramaic.
Yes.
So that alone ought to be enough. Uh, the Bible is the Word of God. Jews and Christians can agree on that. And it's not just 10 chapters, it's 10 of the most exciting chapters of the Bible. There's Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's all this great stuff about Daniel and his great, praying to God 3 times a day under pain of death and all of this. This stuff is all there. It's very important stuff. So that alone is worth it. But there's also this thing about since it's only 10 chapters, it's kind of hard to get really fluent in Aramaic without reading a lot of text in it. And by the way, for somebody that knows Hebrew, Aramaic is the easiest second language you will have
Mm.
ever learned because it's so similar to Hebrew. And if you speak modern Hebrew, half of modern Hebrew is Aramaic anyway. The vocabulary.
Really?
Yeah, there's a lot of influence there. And so, uh, so what, originally I wanted to read the Imperial Aramaic text, and especially reading the book of Ezra and reading the Aramaic papyrus from Egypt. It's like you're reading another letter from Egypt, reading the book of Ezra. It's the style, the letter style, everything. It's the same thing.
Mhm.
But still not a lot of text. So I wanted to go on, read Qumran, and then read the Aramaic Targumim. And you had a guest on your program earlier, Ed Cook. And I remember back
Yes.
in the 1980s, Ed Cook came to HUC when I was working my PhD under Professor Stephen Kaufman. And he was working at the Comprehensive Aramaic Lexicon Project. And of course, I was too, as anybody that had anything to do with Kaufman at the time, you're studying with him. And of course, you're going to be doing something for the Comprehensive Aramaic Lexicon Project that he was heading up anyway. And so I remember talking to Ed Cook, and I'd read a little bit of Targumic Aramaic before, but didn't really feel comfortable with it. And I said, "Hey, could we read the Targumim together?" And he said, "Yeah, sure." We started with Targum Unkilos, Genesis 1, verse 1, together in the upstairs of that cow room. I'll never forget that. And that started me my journey. My goal was to read all of the Targumim in Aramaic. And uh, and I eventually did reach that goal. And then I wanted to read the Midrashim in Aramaic and the Talmuds, and there's a lot of stuff in Jewish Aramaic dialects. But at any rate, um, and by the way, Ed Cook his recommendation, introduced me to Roy Brown and got me my first job right before I made Aliyah to Israel with Oak Tree Software, translating the Targumim for Oak Tree Software. They're now being published in hard copy by Gesher Media. But
Yes. I met him at
and
SBL, and that's how I knew about your book.
yeah, okay. So that's great. And, Professor Stephen Kaufman, I mean, he influenced me in so many ways. I remember in a used bookstore in Japan, years before I ever went to HUC, I picked up a copy of his book, The Akkadian Influences on Aramaic.
Yes.
And I was like, wow, this is really cool. It would be great to study with this guy someday. And then I eventually was able to realize that dream. And there's where I met a whole host of other great scholars and people like Ed Cook as well. But
That must have been an interesting bookstore in Japan.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Of all the things. And I tell people you've got to uh, and I think your predominant audience is Christian, and so I tell Christians you've got to read the Targumim.
Mm,
They give you an early Jewish interpretation of the Bible, and they're fascinating for that. Now, every translation is an interpretation, but the
mhm,
Targumim especially are. Uh, and that the Targumim were not meant to be, I believe, that they were not meant to be a standalone translation from the beginning. Unlike, say, the Septuagint, which is in Greek, right, or the Latin Vulgate, or the Syriac Peshitta, they were meant to be for somebody who had no access to the Hebrew at all. But the Targumim, the tradition was in the Second Temple period, and for many years, and still is in the Yemenite tradition today. I've davened in Yemenite synagogues in Israel,
mm,
and still read the Targumim in the
mm.
synagogue with the Torah and Haftarah, and it's fascinating. But you would read the Targum. Well, actually, you wouldn't read it. That's wrong. The Talmud's very specific. You would read the Torah in Hebrew and it had to be read out loud, even if you knew the whole Torah by heart. And half the people in my synagogue here locally know the whole Torah by heart in Hebrew.
Mm.
You can't recite it from memory. You have to read it out loud when you in public reading. But the Aramaic Targum, you can't read that. That has to be recited orally from a memorized oral tradition. And so, um, and so they already know Hebrew, but maybe their Hebrew is, evidence today is growing consensus. I think it's pretty much a consensus among most Hebrewists today that Hebrew was still spoken throughout the Second Temple period.
Mm.
And in fact, the Mishnah was written down at about 200 CE by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi because Hebrew was uh, no longer was being replaced by Aramaic, and there was danger that it would be lost. And so that's why Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote down the oral Torah that was never meant to be written down. He wrote it down then for for the first time. And and we have witness to that right in the Mishnah when it says that we wouldn't have known what, for example, the word for broom meant, matate, if it hadn't been for the old lady that swept the house for the rabbi. We heard her call out one day, hand me the matate, that I could atate the floor. And all the rabbis looked at each other and said, that's what that word means. It's a hapakama that occurs in the book of Isaiah one time, right? In the whole Bible. And and the whole bunch of words that passage in the Mishnah lists that we wouldn't have known what it meant if it hadn't been for, these old people that didn't, that still remembered what they meant. So there's danger that uh, oral the oral Torah would be forgotten, and that's why it was written down at that period. So, and so the idea is that the written Torah is fixed and you can no longer adjust that. But after Ezra, you can't make any changes to the written Torah. But the oral Torah, how do you change that? There's already evidence for this in the book of Ezra. Ezra himself gives a chidush in there, a new interpretation. I might go off. You could cut off whatever you want if you think it's too much. But right there, when I read Ezra with my students, I point out how um, you know the written Torah forbids intermarriage with Canaanite women,
Mm.
but so you have even respected leaders of the community that have intermarried with non-Jewish but non-Canaanite women from, the Hittites and the Babylonians and everything else. But that's not forbidden by the literal reading of the Torah. And so Ezra says, well, okay, that's the literal, but he's clearly looking at what's the intention of the Torah. It's that they not lead you into avodah zarah, into idolatry. That's the intent of the Torah. And they actually welcome the book of Ezra. It says they welcomed everybody from among the nations who had
Right.
purified themselves from the uncleanness of the nations, which means idolatry. Doesn't
Yes.
matter heritage. If you're a physical descendant of, but if you of Israel, but you worship Avodah Zarah, you can't participate in the rebuilding of the temple.
Yes.
And but if you did, then it's open. We're welcome. They're not strict separatists, unlike what I read that some Bible commentators have said they were. According to text, they were not. But at any
Right.
rate, he is giving a chidush there, which is what we say when there's a new halachic ruling, and he's not tampering with the written Torah that he can't touch now. He's saying that we're going behind the intent of it, and now you cannot marry a non-Jewish wife, period, unless they adopt the worship of the God of Israel. And that's, a gesher. It's a bridge until a modern practice uh, of conversion rites and so on. But in other words, you have to worship the God of Israel to be accepted into the community, but and adopt the Jewish culture and all that stuff. But at any rate, there's a chiddush. Well, now how do you continue updating the Torah with changing circumstances? So the
Mm.
oral was one of the ways that you do that, and the Targumim were a key means in Second Temple period. So now you're reading every Shabbat the written Torah, but then when you have this memorized oral tradition that's in Aramaic, now we're able to explain, okay, Al tavashel gadid b'chalev imo. Do not boil the kid in its mother's milk. Well, what does that mean? Okay, then you get the rabbinic interpretation about, the not literally cooking a kid in his mother's milk, but also not eating milk and dairy together and not profiting from the mixture of the two. In other words, you get the rabbinic interpretation of that. This is how the rabbis want you to understand that. That's, in the Targumim. What does it mean to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind? Well, the Targum tells us all of your kol me'odecha. Everywhere else we read in the Torah, me'od is an adverb meaning much, right? But
Hmm.
here it interprets it as with your property, with your wealth. That's what it means to love the Lord with all of my might. And so, in other words, it's an interpretation. So it has that function, but it also, obviously I disagree with the Targumists that say that Hebrew was a, already a dead language and that they only understand Aramaic at that
Mm.
stage. No, no. And even later stages, people davening in synagogue would still, as today, know, religious people would typically know uh, uh, biblical Hebrew as well. But at the same time, in the Second Temple period, when it's still a living language, the vocabulary is still limited. Looking at the
Mm.
analogy of bilingual cultures today,
Right.
uh, you know, like in Haifa, where Jews and Arabs live together and coexist very well. Um, I've been in Arab friends' house. I didn't even know thought they were Jewish, the whole because of the way they speak with, a Jewish accent. And by the way, I really love the Arabic accent of Hebrew because it's more accurate. But at any rate, um, and I thought, wow, this person's an Arab. I just assumed they were Jewish until the phone rings and they start speaking to their parent in Arabic. And I said, oh my gosh, you're an Arab. But all of your library, the books, everything's in Hebrew, TV's in Hebrew. And yeah, that's right. Many parents, Arab parents in Haifa, prefer to send their children to Jewish schools. And as a result, everything, their whole world is in Hebrew. So they speak Arabic, but the vocabulary is limited. So a
Mm.
number of times I've been talking, especially when I was first trying to learn to speak Arabic, I would tell my Arab friends, speak, "Ehki ma'ai bil-Arabi, talk to me in Arabic." And they would say, Arabi kharban, meaning, my Arabic is broken. Often they would tell me that um, because certain subjects, they were limited in the vocabulary. They would talk about those subjects even to their friends in Hebrew. So, or I look at American Jewish friends here where their children grow up bilingual. They grow up in Israeli Jewish schools speaking Hebrew as their mother tongue, as their native language, but also at home they speak English. And you think without an accent. So it's deceptive. You think, yeah, they're perfectly bilingual until I'm watching a movie with him, and then I have to stop the movie and explain what these or that words mean in English. And I realize the vocabulary is very limited. And so when they go to apply for a school, maybe in a university in America, they have to really increase the vocabulary in English. And
Yes.
that situation that I believe Second Temple Israel was. Hebrew was still a spoken language. Parts of the Galilee probably wasn't. They probably did just speak Aramaic at home, but certainly in Judea and uh, Christians always ask, what about Jesus, his home? From Judea, so probably spoke Hebrew at home and maybe Aramaic in the streets, but probably spoke Hebrew at home. And there's good evidence from the New Testament, even that in Judea, even regular secular subjects. We're told, for example, when Paul was arrested in the Temple Mount, he addressed the crowd in Hebrew. That's what the Greek text says. And so it's good evidence that Hebrew was still spoken at that period. There's other evidence too, but at any rate, just pointing that out. So, how do you explain this bilingualism? If Hebrew's still spoken, then why do you need Aramaic? Well, for
Mm.
one, it's a way of uh, giving the um, ongoing rabbinic interpretation for
Mm,
the
mm, mm.
in an area where the written Torah is fixed. You can't adjust that anymore, but you can give the oral Torah, which is flexible and changes with every generation. How do we apply the fixed written Torah for each generation? And the Targumim were a part of that. And so, for two, one, it's giving the ongoing rabbinic interpretation, although sometimes the Targum does give an interpretation that's at odds with the rabbinic interpretation, the standard rabbinic interpretation of a later period, which is also interesting. But the other thing is because the vocabulary of the Hebrew speakers in the Second Temple period, I believe, were more limited. You get a feeling for that when you read Qumran Hebrew. I mean, they're still writing books in Hebrew. They're trying to imitate the style of biblical Hebrew with the Vayiktols and all of that.
Mm.
But it looks like the vocabulary is much more limited. Qumran Hebrew is much easier Hebrew to read
Mm.
than even the Bible because the vocabulary is much more limited. For that matter, Mishnaic Hebrew, I think you could say the same thing. It's
Mm.
actually an Hebrew to read than that of the Bible. But at any rate, those are some of the reasons why. Oh, another reason is because there are parts of the Hebrew Bible that are better intelligible in the light of a knowledge of Aramaic. In
Mm.
fact, Semitic as a whole. but certainly like Gary Rendsburg's work on Israelite Hebrew, what he calls Israelian Hebrew, and things like that have shown that it's more understandable in the light of a knowledge of Aramaic as well. And so all of those are good reasons for uh, reading Aramaic. And I especially advise my Christian students to work in the Targumim and the Midrashim as well, which I think my Christian students find very helpful in everything from preparing sermons for the rest of their lives to study the Bible and so on. And I point out, even though you may not always agree with a rabbi's interpretation on a passage, I don't either. Uh, but uh, I find, because I also use the scientific method when I study the
Mm,
Bible, I study the faith approach and the scientific approach. Uh, but I find that I wouldn't have come to the conclusions I did about an exegesis of a passage if I hadn't looked at the rabbis first, even when I disagree with them.
mm.
And, just to point out, as an Orthodox Jewish rabbi, I do use a faith approach, but I also use this modern scientific approach. And typically, it's like people work in either scholarship or the traditional approach. I do both, and sometimes it gets me into trouble in both sides, in the synagogue and in the university, because there's a tension between the two. They don't always agree with each other, but I try to solve these tensions as best as my finite knowledge will give me. And but at any rate, so I start with the tradition, but and as Professor Weisberg taught me from HUC years ago, takes big guns to shoot down tradition. But,
That's a good line right there,
scientific
isn't it?
method, right. But whenever science shows me that no, the tradition was wrong here, then I have to be honest and go with that. But at any rate, that's my long answer to your question.
That's fantastic. Well, as we conclude, what advice do you give to students of Aramaic to foster maintaining their knowledge of the language once their formal studies are complete?
Yeah, and that's the really good question, I think, is to begin with, most of my learning of all the Semitic languages that I studied for my PhD really came after I finished the doctorate, because there's when I continued reading. Remember
Mm,
my goal, reading, 10,000 pages and all these major Semitic languages and everything that I'm still working on. And so I like to give options to my students when they towards the end of their time of studying with me. And depending on how much time you have, so for example, one of the things that I do is, every year we're supposed to read, the Talmud tells us, Shtaim Mikra Achat Targum. So 2 times, you're supposed to read the weekly Torah portion every week, twice in Hebrew and once in Targum in translation. And by Targum, they meant Unkelos, the Targum of the Babylonian Talmud understood as Targum. And so, but today the rabbis say, well, you can read any whatever modern language, you want as your second language. So for me, well, I have many second languages. So here I like to alternate reading the Torah alongside some other translation. So I've read through all of the rabbinic Jewish Targumim at one time or another in that cycle. I've read through even the Samaritan Torah with their Aramaic Targum.
mhm.
I've read through Torah in Arabic. In fact, I'm going over it again this year in Arabic. I've read it in Syriac and Greek and French, just, every classical Ethiopic, Ge'ez, which is, another fantastic Semitic language. But at any rate, so that's one way I suggest is you can read through your Torah with the Aramaic Targumim. And Syriac's also an important Aramaic dialect, I should point out, and a lot of other good texts in Syriac, even besides the Bible too. But uh, that's one way. Now, the first time you do that may take a lot of time. At various times of a student's life, I say you may not have time to do that. So there's another approach, 5 minutes a day. And there's where I like the daily dose of Hebrew and daily dose of Aramaic. It actually works. And so I typically have, because I work in a lot of languages and I try to keep them up. And I'm not strong in all of them at any given time. At one time or another, I was strong in all of them, but at any given time, I have one or two, like, a couple of languages that are on the front burner. Now, Hebrew and Aramaic, I feel like I no longer have to be intentional about keeping those up because I'm always working in those
Mm,
languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. And, but the other languages I have to be intentional about. Uh, I will just try to, like, I'll do 5 minutes of, right now it's 5 minutes of Ge'ez, classical Ethiopic, 5 minutes of German, 5 minutes of French, 5 minutes of Akkadian. And, some days, yeah, I will miss. That's right, because life intervenes and whatever. And 5 minutes of these languages, they're on the back burner. And then on some particular year, when okay, this year I'm going to go back and reread the Torah in Ge'ez, let's say, then Ge'ez will be in the front burner. I'll go back over the Ge'ez grammar and everything. Or if I teach a Ge'ez class, then I'll put it in the front burner. Or if I teach Akkadian, I'll put Akkadian back in the front burner or whatever. And another approach, a third approach, is maybe you say even 5 minutes a day. It's just it's hard for me to be consistent with it. So on Shabbat, maybe just on Shabbat, take an hour or so. I mean,
mm,
it's Shabbat. For us, it's Shabbat. On any day that you can relax. A lot of pastors, Monday is a day that they can take off and chill. Whatever day for you, just take off and maybe spend an hour reading Aramaic text or something like that. Today, with comprehensive Aramaic lexicon online, you can just click on the word and you see what it means. There are programs like Accordance that, with the Targumim, you can click on it and whatever. And so there are a lot of tools available today that make it a lot easier. In the old days, I traipsed through all the dictionaries and everything, hard copy stuff back in the late Bronze Age. We were still reading books, but at any rate, so those are
well,
three suggestions that I give for.
books are good.
Yeah,
I
that's
like
right.
books.
That's right. Thank you. So those are three suggested ways that somebody could do that. And it might be then at different periods in your life, the student may then have more time that, okay, now I can really devote concentrated time every
Yeah.
day to read these languages. But even then, if you just do 5 minutes a day, I'm telling you, you can keep it up. And then later on, you can, as you have time and whatever, you may be able to jump into it with more depth.
Mm.
And
Well, Dr. Clem, thanks so much for your time today. It's offered us a fantastic window into your life and getting to know you. And I, for one, hope that we have the opportunity to actually meet in person someday, because this is
yeah,
still a virtual meeting here. We want to meet in person. And, perhaps at a professional meeting or even in the land of Israel. Who knows?
yeah, you're welcome to come visit us. So that would
That's
be
great.
great. Yes,
That's great. Well, the enthusiasts of Aramaic is a select community, isn't it?
yes, yes, it is. That's for sure. And
Well, so thank you to our viewers to be able to watch this, our subscribers. We're so thankful that every weekday we're able to read Aramaic text together. If you haven't already, go to dailydoseofaramaic.com and subscribe to the emailing list so you get your daily email reminding you to hit the link and go to the videos like this. Thanks again,
oh,
Dr. Clem.
yes, thank you. All the best.